Welcome to Alabama Short Stories, when you're a little behind on your Alabama history. I'm your host, Sean Wright. My grandfather was in the U.S. Navy, and when World War II ended, he, his wife, and 2 daughters settled in Pritchard, Alabama. It was an ideal location, an hour from where my grandfather and grandmother grew up, and Granddad could get work as a machinist at Brookley Field. They lived in that house on Timothy Avenue until I was about 10, when my grandparents moved up the road to 8 Mile. When I think of that house in Pritchard and the time we would spend there in the summer, my senses come alive. I can feel the summer heat and smell the paper mill located a short 2 miles away on the Mobile River. I can feel the rough St. Augustine grass on my feet and taste the figs growing on the tree by the garage. Inside the house were plastic runners on the carpet, fans to distribute the air around the house, and my grandfather's worn-out lazy boy recliner. We didn't go far from this house at the corner of Timothy Avenue and Mayer Avenue. There was Plateau Baptist Church, where my parents were wed and my grandparents attended. We would cross the Mobile River on the bridge overlooking the paper mill as we made our way to the causeway, passing the USS Alabama to go cane pole fishing or eat dinner at Palmer's Restaurant. I didn't know much about this corner of Mobile, Alabama, and I certainly didn't know about the history of Plateau, Magazine, and Africatown until decades later. I probably learned about it around the same time you did in the past few years. The book, The Last Slave Ship by Ben Raines, the Netflix documentary Descendant, and other magazine articles and television specials put a spotlight on one last awful chapter of slavery, if there could ever be such a thing. Let me give you an overview. The slave trade had been active in North America since 1619, when the ship White Lion brought slaves to the Jamestown colony. Millions of captives had been transported to these shores by 1807, when the U.S. Congress outlawed American participation in the slave trade, but not slavery itself. Wealthy and arrogant, Mobile's Timothy Mayer had a fast ship called the Clotilda, and was sure he could traffic African slaves under the noses of authorities looking for human traffickers from the coast of Africa to Mobile Bay. Mayer made a bet that he could bring a shipload of slaves from Africa within 2 years. Pretending to make a trip to the Caribbean, the Clotilda went to the African slave trading port of Ouida. 125 men and women were purchased, and they started loading them onto the ship. The captain saw a ship he believed was an anti-slave patrol, and they quickly set sail with only 110 people on board as they made a run for it. After a trip across the Atlantic and through the Caribbean, dodging patrols along the way, the Clotilda snuck into Mobile Bay and past Mobile. They were towed up the Spanish River, where the slaves were unloaded onto Mayer's steamboat, the Zora. They were taken upriver and hidden in the canebrake, naked, cold, and with no clue where they were or what would happen to them. The Clotilda was taken to 12 Mile Island, where it was burned to the waterline and sunk to hide the crime. The slaves were distributed amongst the financial backers and sent to plantations upriver. The smuggling of Africans into Mobile Bay was the worst-kept secret. It even became national news within a day. Searches for the captives were unsuccessful, and none of the Clotilda crew members or investors were prosecuted. And with the onset of the Civil War the following year, this ugly chapter in Alabama's history would be swept under the rug. The story of Clotilda had been no secret in Mobile for the past 160-plus years. It's a story that white Mobile would like to ignore, and one that the descendants of the former slaves would like to know more about. Ben Raines' book is where I learned about it, but there are a couple of other authors who had sought to bring the story to light. Zora Neale Hurston was born in the East Alabama town of Notasulga in 1891, 31 years after the Clotilda entered Mobile Bay. She was the 5th child in the family, and within 3 years, the family moved to Eatonville, Florida, an all-black town outside of Orlando, Florida. Hurston was a good student and attended Howard College, but had to drop out due to a lack of funds. She wanted to write and be in New York, so in 1925, she earned a scholarship and entered Barnard College as the only black student. Hurston developed an interest in anthropology, and a professor encouraged her to collect stories, language, superstitions, music, religious practices, and more of the culture of African Americans who were migrating out of the Jim Crow South and moving to Harlem. She met Langston Hughes and other creatives who all became instrumental in the Harlem Renaissance. Hurston would write about the black Southern experience the way no white writer could ever do. Hurston was well known for her works of fiction, including Moses, Man of the Mountain, where she writes about the book of Exodus and Moses from an African-American perspective, and their eyes were watching God, a story about an African-American woman's quest for love and self-discovery in the 20th century South. This book landed at 97 on Reader's Digest's Best 100 Books of All Time this past year. In 1927, Zora Neale Hurston went to Plateau, Alabama to interview Cudjo Lewis, one of the 110 souls that made the trip on the Clotilda in 1860, the last one alive to tell the story. Hurston was sent by her professor and mentor at Barnard, Franz Boas. She published Cudjo's own story of the last African slave in the Journal of Negro History based on her interviews with Lewis. The trip affected Hurston greatly. In 1931, she returned and spent 3 months with Lewis, living in Africatown and learning more about his story. She wrote a book about it called Barracoon. Barracoon is Spanish for barracks, where the captured Africans were held before being sold into slavery and shipped abroad. Unfortunately, Hurston's original article, Cudjo's own story of the last African slaver, became a low point in her writing career. According to Hurston's biographer, large portions of the article were plagiarized from the book Historic Sketches of the South. Emma Langdon Roche was born in Mobile in 1894, the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had become well established in the mortuary business, and a mother whose father was one of Mobile's preeminent architects and builders. After graduating from Mobile's Convent of the Visitation, Roche studied art in Mobile but was told to go to New York and study at the Art Students League. There she was encouraged to paint everyday scenes and people, and when she returned to Mobile, she continued doing so. Not just in her well-to-do white community, she branched out to learn about the cultures outside her community. Roche ventured into the Plateau community, where she would get to know the last 9 survivors of the Clotilda, including Cudjo Lewis. Roche would create illustrations and photos of the survivors and collect their stories into the book Historic Sketches of the South, published in 1914. While I haven't read the book Historic Sketches of the South, I have thumbed through it. At the beginning of Chapter 9, titled Tarker Life in America, there's a photo of the Clotilda wreck with several boats in the background. Over 100 years ago, the location of the wreck was not so much of a secret as it was while Ben Raines searched for the wreck just a few years ago. Hurston did plagiarize Roche's work. Maybe she didn't consider citing passages from Historic Sketches of the South. Perhaps she was just lazy about it. I try to stay on top of citations when writing these stories and make sure they are published in the book version of the podcast. It's tough to keep up with them all. The scholar Genevieve Sexton believes that there could be several reasons why she plagiarized. She wrote in The Last Witness, Testimony and Desire in Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon. So perhaps Hurston's first attempt to meet with Kusula was a failure, a closure. One door slammed when another door opened at the Mobile Historical Society, where a quaint little tome sat smugly on the shelves, beckoning her. Hurston stood before her mentor, Franz Boas, and in tears asked for forgiveness as he gave her the once-over. It was probably a learning moment for Hurston as she was forgiven, and I'm sure it played a part when she went back to Africatown a few years later to research what would become Barracoon. Sexton did point out one positive of the plagiarism. In places, Hurston removed Roche's racist hand and replaced it with her empowering one. Cudjo Lewis would pass away in 1935. Emma Roche would live out her life in Mobile. She helped establish Mobile's first publicly funded museum in 1936. She died in 1945. Zora Neale Hurston's life turned for the worse later in life. In 1950, she was falsely accused of molesting a young boy. The public humiliation was too much, so she left Harlem for Florida, and for the next decade she struggled to find work, making a living as a maid. She suffered a stroke in 1959 and was admitted to a nursing home. Hurston died of a heart attack on January 28, 1960. She was buried in an unmarked grave until author Alice Walker, who felt Hurston influenced her, provided a headstone in 1975. Hurston had written 5 books, but none were in print at the time of her death, and there was one book she could not publish in her lifetime, Barracoon. She offered it to many publishers, but they all passed. One said he would publish it if she rewrote it in a language rather than dialect. You see, Barracoon is written as a monologue from Lewis with occasional observations from Hurston. Hurston refused to change it. Barracoon would eventually be published in 2018, 58 years after she died and 87 years after she returned to Africa Town. 4 years later, journalist and Fairhope native Ben Raines would publish The Last Slave Ship, telling the story of Clotilda and how the wreckage was found in 2019. There is a call to dig the Clotilda from the river mud and to be displayed in Africa Town. The boat and plans for what will happen are with the Alabama Historical Commission. Whatever happens, we know the Clotilda and its story will not be lost to history. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alabama Short Stories Podcast. I'm happy to announce that Volume 2 of the Alabama Short Stories book is now available and features stories from seasons 4 through 6. You can purchase it and Volume 1 online at Amazon.com and other online retailers. If you'd like to support your local bookstore, you can purchase it through bookshop.org, where your purchases will help financially support independent bookstores. You can find links in the show notes and on the website. See you next time at Alabama Short Stories.